A Christmas party took a shocking turn when a young woman was found dead in the garden. What started as a cheerful celebration turned into a chilling mystery. The police quickly focused on one man, a husband with secrets no one expected. The case isn't just about the tragedy, it's about uncovering what led to this moment. With whispers of betrayal, hidden motives, and mounting clues, this isn't your usual investigation. As the pieces come together, the big question remains: who is really behind this, and how far would they go to keep their secrets hidden? Let's start from the beginning and see how it all unraveled. Lisa had always trusted her instincts, but lately something about her husband, Mark, felt off. He was coming home later than usual, glued to his phone, and brushing off her questions with vague excuses. At first, she tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling, telling herself she was imagining things. But the small signs kept adding up. One evening, she noticed a faint lipstick stain on his collar. Mark shrugged it off, saying it was probably from brushing past someone at work. It didn't feel right, but Lisa stayed quiet, deciding to pay closer attention. The next day, she found herself scrolling through last year's Christmas party photos, trying to remember the man she once thought she knew so well. Mark's sudden chuckles at his phone, his quick exits from the room when it buzzed, and his overly casual explanations only deepened her doubts. Something wasn't adding up, and Lisa couldn't ignore it anymore. She knew she had to stop second-guessing herself and start looking for answers. The office Christmas party was fast approaching, and Lisa decided she couldn't stay in the dark any longer. Mark had been brushing it off, calling it a small, boring event, but his nervous reactions told a different story. When Lisa casually offered to join him, his quick refusal only fueled her suspicions. Mark had been guarding his phone, avoiding eye contact, and giving excuses that didn't sit right with her. Something was happening, and Lisa felt the answers might be at that party. She made up her mind she would go, whether he wanted her there or not. If Mark had been hiding something, this would be her chance to find out. As the party night arrived, Lisa pretended to act as though everything was normal. When she stepped out with Mark, his hesitation was clear, but he didn't argue. Lisa's determination was stronger than her fear. This wasn't about just suspicion anymore, it was about uncovering the truth. When Lisa arrived at the party, the scene was far from the dull gathering Mark had described. The grand venue sparkled with holiday lights, laughter echoed through the room, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits. Lisa couldn't help but notice the surprised looks from some of Mark's colleagues when they saw her. It was clear they hadn't expected her to come. As the night unfolded, Lisa spotted her. Sophie, the woman she had only heard about but never met. Sophie was striking, younger, and carried herself with a confidence that made Lisa's stomach tighten. When Sophie approached them, her tone was sweet but carried an edge Lisa couldn't miss. "Mark didn't mention he'd be bringing you," she said, her smile faintly smug. Lisa introduced herself politely, but her mind was racing. Throughout the night, she observed the subtle glances between Mark and Sophie, the small smiles, the way Sophie laughed a little too much at Mark's jokes. It was all too familiar. Lisa's suspicions weren't just confirmed, they were staring her right in the face. But instead of reacting, she stayed calm, knowing she needed to keep watching and wait for the right moment to act. As the evening went on, Lisa couldn't take her eyes off Sophie. Every interaction between her and Mark felt too comfortable, too personal. Sophie's casual touches on Mark's arm, the way she leaned in to speak to him, and the secretive smiles they exchanged painted a picture Lisa didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. At one point, Lisa overheard Sophie talking to another colleague. "I love my gift," Sophie said with a soft laugh, her fingers brushing a necklace around her neck. The words stung, and Lisa's mind instantly went to the receipt she had found earlier. Could it really be the same necklace? It felt too much to be a coincidence. By now, Lisa knew this wasn't just some harmless flirtation. Sophie wasn't hiding her interest in Mark, if anything, she seemed to flaunt it. The more Lisa watched, the clearer it became. Sophie wasn't just involved in Mark's life, she was confident in her place in it, as if she had nothing to lose. For Lisa, this realization wasn't just painful, it was a turning point. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and it was worse than she'd imagined. As Lisa continued to observe, she noticed how Sophie seemed to thrive on the attention. She moved through the room effortlessly, but her gaze kept drifting back to Mark. The way she carried herself, her confident smile, the way she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes made it clear she wasn't just another colleague. She wanted to be seen. When Sophie finally caught Lisa's eye from across the room, her expression shifted, almost as if she enjoyed the tension. Lisa refused to look away, holding her ground. It was a quiet but sharp exchange, one woman staking her claim, the other standing her ground. For Lisa, this moment felt like a silent confrontation, one that carried more weight than any words could. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to be trying too hard to act normal, avoiding any prolonged interaction with Sophie in front of Lisa. But the damage was done. His quick glances toward Sophie and his nervous energy confirmed everything Lisa had suspected. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Mark and Sophie shared something real, and neither of them was doing much to hide it anymore. As the night went on, Lisa noticed Sophie slipping out of the crowded ballroom, a glance over her shoulder hinting she was expecting someone to follow. Moments later, Mark excused himself, mumbling something about needing fresh air. Lisa's chest tightened. She knew where he was going, and this time she wasn't going to sit back and wonder. Quietly, Lisa followed at a distance, stepping into the dimly lit garden just in time to see Mark and Sophie near a bench, their voices low but tense. Hidden behind a hedge, Lisa strained to catch their conversation. Sophie's tone was sharp, filled with frustration. "You said you'd handle this," Sophie hissed. "I'm tired of waiting." Mark's voice, usually calm, wavered with nerves. "It's complicated," he muttered. "You have to give me time." Lisa felt a wave of anger and humiliation rise as she clung to the shadows, her worst fears now undeniable. But before she could process it fully, the conversation shifted. Sophie's voice became louder, more confrontational. "If you won't tell her, I will," she said, her words hanging heavy in the cold night air. Lisa's heart raced, torn between stepping out and staying hidden. She knew this wasn't the end of what she needed to discover, it was just the beginning of something far darker. After returning to the party, Lisa tried to steady herself, but the confrontation she had overheard kept playing in her mind. She watched as Mark re-entered the ballroom, acting as if nothing had happened. His smile looked forced, his laughter hollow. Lisa clenched her fists. Whatever he was hiding, she was determined to uncover it. Later that evening, while Mark was busy talking with a group of colleagues, Lisa slipped away to the coat room. Her hands trembled as she reached into his coat pocket, feeling for anything that could confirm what she already knew. Her fingers brushed against something small and smooth. She pulled out a velvet box and opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet with the words "Forever S" engraved on the clasp. Lisa's stomach dropped. The engraving wasn't for her, and she didn't need to guess who this was. This wasn't just an affair, it was an intimate betrayal, planned and deliberate. Lisa closed the box and slid it back into the pocket, her heart pounding with anger and disbelief. She had all the proof she needed now, but the night wasn't over. Not yet. The party buzzed on, but Lisa felt disconnected from the noise and laughter around her. She kept glancing between Mark and Sophie, her mind consumed with what she'd discovered. Every interaction, every glance they shared felt like a cruel confirmation of what was happening behind her back. She was planning her next move when a sharp, piercing scream shattered the festive atmosphere. Guests froze, their chatter replaced by murmurs of confusion. Lisa's pulse quickened as she followed the growing crowd toward the glass doors leading to the garden. Stepping outside, her breath caught at the sight before her. Sophie's lifeless body lay crumpled on the ground, her bright red dress stark against the snow. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the pristine white in a way that felt surreal. Gasps and whispers filled the air as someone checked for a pulse and shook their head. Sophie was gone. Lisa gripped the edge of the doorframe, her thoughts racing. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was murder. And as her eyes darted toward Mark, she saw the panic on his face. his expression ashen. She knew this night had just taken a turn she never expected, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the police arrived and began questioning guests, Lisa couldn't stop watching Mark. He stood near the edge of the ballroom, his face pale and his movements stiff. He wasn't the composed, smooth-talking man she knew. He looked cornered, like someone with something to hide. When an officer approached him, Mark straightened up quickly, forcing what looked like an unnatural calm. Lisa moved closer, listening to fragments of his responses. "I was with her earlier," he admitted, his voice low, "but when I left, she was fine." His words sounded rehearsed, almost too careful, as though he'd thought through exactly what to say. Around the room, whispers were spreading. Lisa caught bits of conversations, guests murmuring about the argument they'd seen between Mark and Sophie in the garden. Some even claimed he was the last person with her before the scream. Lisa's stomach churned. She wanted to believe he wasn't capable of this, but the evidence stacking up around him was hard to ignore. Mark avoided her gaze when he returned to the room, heading straight for the bar. Lisa could see his hands shaking as he gripped his drink. She couldn't tell if it was guilt, fear, or both. But one thing was clear: Mark wasn't telling the whole truth. And for Lisa, that raised even more questions about what else he might be hiding. Lisa was barely holding it together when Detective Graham approached her. He introduced himself with a calm but firm tone, carrying a notepad and a sharp gaze that seemed to cut through any pretense. "Mrs. Harrington, I need to ask you a few questions about tonight," he said, his voice steady, almost too steady for the chaos surrounding them. Lisa nodded, taking a deep breath. She knew this moment was coming. "I knew Sophie," she admitted when he asked. "She worked with my husband." Her voice was calm, but inside she was unraveling. The detective's questions became more pointed. "Did you see anything unusual? Interact with her tonight?" Lisa hesitated before answering. "We spoke briefly. It wasn't friendly." Lisa paused, her throat tightening. "She had a personal relationship with my husband. I confronted her, and it got tense." Detective Graham didn't react visibly, but his pen didn't stop moving. "And after that, I overheard her and Mark arguing in the garden," Lisa continued. She was angry, threatening him, saying things needed to change. I didn't see what happened after that." When the detective asked if Lisa had noticed anything suspicious in the garden, she felt a lump in her throat. She couldn't hold back any longer. "I found a scarf," she said, her voice trembling. "There was blood on it. I didn't know what to do, so I kept it." Her admission caused the detective to pause. He asked her to hand it over, and with shaking hands, Lisa pulled it from her clutch. As the scarf disappeared into an evidence bag, Lisa felt the weight of her discovery sink in. She had given them a key piece of the puzzle, but it also meant she was now deeply entangled in the investigation. The detective's final question cut through her thoughts. "Do you think your husband is capable of harming Sophie?" Lisa froze, her breath catching. "I don't know," she whispered, the words heavier than she expected. It was the closest she'd come to admitting just how much her world had fallen apart in one night. Hours after handing over the bloodied scarf, Lisa was trying to piece everything together when Detective Graham approached her again. His expression was more serious now, his tone sharper than before. "Mrs. Harrington," he began, holding her gaze, "we've run some initial tests on the scarf." Lisa's stomach tightened. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The blood matches Sophie's," he said, pausing for a moment. "But there's something else. Your fingerprints were found on the fabric." The words hit Lisa like a punch. "What?" she stammered, her heart racing. "I only touched it when I found it. I didn't." Detective Graham raised a hand to calm her, but his gaze didn't soften. "I need to know exactly how you handled the scarf. Where did you find it? Did anyone else touch it before you brought it to us?" Lisa shook her head, trying to focus through the panic rising in her chest. "I found it near the bench in the garden where Sophie and Mark were arguing. I didn't see anyone else near it. I just picked it up. I didn't think." Her voice trailed off as the detective nodded, scribbling notes in his pad. "We're not accusing you of anything," he said carefully, "but your prints complicate the situation. We'll need to investigate this further." Lisa nodded numbly, her mind reeling. The scarf, which she thought would shed light on Sophie's death, had now put her in the spotlight. The very evidence she hoped would help solve the mystery was now tying her closer to a tragedy she didn't fully understand. She felt trapped, every step forward sinking her deeper into the unknown. The tension in the room was suffocating as guests whispered about the investigation, and Lisa sat alone, trying to make sense of it all. She felt every glance directed her way, each one filled with suspicion. Just as she was beginning to feel the weight of it all crushing her, Detective Graham entered the ballroom holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a knife, its sleek blade stained with blood. "This was found near the hedges in the garden," the detective announced to the group, his voice commanding and firm. The room fell silent. Lisa's eyes locked on the weapon, her pulse racing. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Someone had tried to hide it, but not well enough. As the detectives' team moved to process the knife, Lisa's mind spun. The garden, the same place where she had overheard Sophie and Mark arguing, where she had found the scarf, now seemed even more sinister. The location of the knife wasn't far from where Sophie's body was discovered. Detective Graham approached Lisa again, his tone more urgent this time. "Mrs. Harrington, are you absolutely certain you didn't see anyone else near the garden?" he asked. Lisa tried to recall every detail. She remembered the shadow she had noticed earlier, fleeting and almost unnoticed at the time. "I saw someone," she said finally, her voice hesitant. "It was dark and I didn't get a clear look. But there was a figure near the hedges." The detective nodded, motioning to his team to search the area more thoroughly. Lisa's heart sank as she realized the knife changed everything. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, this was hard evidence. And now, the question wasn't just who had motive, but who was desperate enough to kill to keep their secrets hidden. As the knife was bagged and taken away for analysis, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew heavier. Detective Graham stepped forward again, his tone cutting through the tense silence. "This is now a fully active homicide investigation," he announced. "No one will be allowed to leave the venue until further notice." The room erupted into murmurs of panic and frustration. Guests exchanged nervous glances, some whispering about the evidence that had been uncovered: the blood-stained scarf, the knife, and the last moments they had seen Sophie alive. Lisa stayed quiet, her mind racing. She felt trapped, not just physically, but by the weight of everything she'd witnessed and discovered. Mark, standing by the bar, looked pale and anxious. Lisa watched him carefully, trying to read his body language. He wasn't saying much, but his eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an escape route or someone to blame. Was he nervous because of what he'd done, or because of what someone else might reveal? Detectives began pulling guests aside one by one for questioning, their voices low but their urgency unmistakable. Lisa couldn't help but wonder, was the killer still here? Were they hiding among the same group of people now fidgeting with their drinks and avoiding eye contact? The lockdown turned what had been a festive evening into a claustrophobic nightmare. Lisa sat down, forcing herself to stay calm, but inside she was unraveling. With every minute that passed, the walls seemed to close in, and the truth felt further away than ever. One thing was clear: no one would leave until the detective had answers, no matter how long it took. The air in the ballroom was thick with tension when Detective Graham returned to address the group. This time, his expression was even graver, his voice cutting through the low hum of nervous whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, scanning the room, "we've uncovered significant evidence that suggests this was not an accident. Someone here knows more than they're letting on." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the detective raised a hand to silence them. "The knife found in the garden has been sent for analysis, and we are following up on fingerprints and other forensic details. Until we have all the facts, I'll need your full cooperation." Lisa's chest tightened as she watched Mark shift uncomfortably. The detective's words felt directed at him, or maybe that was just her own suspicion clouding her judgment. Either way, the room felt smaller, the stakes higher. Detective Graham continued, his tone sharp and deliberate. "We are no longer operating under the assumption that this was an isolated act. This was a deliberate crime, and until we uncover the truth, no one will leave this venue. Officers will remain posted at all exits. The announcement hung in the air like a heavy weight. Lisa glanced around, noticing the nervous glances exchanged between some of the guests. For the first time, the idea that the killer was still among them felt terrifyingly real. The whispers grew louder, speculation swirling like a storm, but the detective's steady presence kept the chaos from boiling over. As Graham stepped aside to let his team continue their work, Lisa's gaze landed on Mark again. He wasn't saying a word, but his silence spoke volumes. She couldn't help but wonder, was he scared of being caught? Or was he scared of the truth finally coming to light? Either way, the room had shifted, and the end of the night felt further away than ever. As the night dragged on, the ballroom felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Guests huddled in small groups, exchanging theories and whispers, their nerves fraying with every passing moment. Lisa sat apart, watching the chaos unfold. Every glance, every hushed conversation seemed suspicious now. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions without answers. Detective Graham's team moved methodically through the room, questioning guests and taking notes. Lisa's turn had come and gone, but she couldn't shake the detective's piercing gaze or the weight of the questions he'd asked. Her thoughts kept circling back to the scarf, the knife, the confrontation she had overheard between Sophie and Mark. Nothing fit together cleanly, yet everything pointed towards something much darker than she had imagined. Mark, sitting across the room, avoided her eyes entirely. He looked tense, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Lisa wanted to confront him, to demand the truth, but her anger was mixed with doubt. What if he was innocent? What if she was wrong? But then again, what if she wasn't? The room fell silent when Detective Graham reappeared, his face unreadable. "We've gathered more evidence," he said, his voice steady. "The results will tell us what we need to know. But for now, I'll remind everyone, the truth always comes out." Lisa's pulse quickened. She didn't know what the detective had found, but it was clear the night wasn't over yet. As Graham left the room, she glanced at Mark again. This time, he looked directly at her, his expression unreadable but heavy with something guilt, fear, or a secret he was desperate to keep. For Lisa, one thing was certain. The truth, when it came, would shatter everything she thought she knew. And whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again.